Before we get started actually making some formulas, I want to go ahead and go through some of these notes I made as an introduction. And the first thing is, please, if you're into this subject and only watch one of the videos in full, it should be this one. And that's because, in my humble opinion, it all centers around the mediums if the goal is to tint flowers and leaves. And while I may impart more information than you care to know, I really think that I'll be sharing some stuff that you can take and run with your own formulas and ideas, and you just don't know what part of the video is going to contain things that you might be interested in. So I do suggest following along to the whole thing, and this is why I have notes so that I can try to stay on track and not get totally off track. As I mentioned a number of times, I'm creating the color enhancement playlist to take a deep dive into the subject. I've been messing around with color enhancing for decades and decades, and I have a lot to say. And so if I'm being more detailed than somebody cares to throughout the playlist, then scrub along the timeline. Otherwise, just know that it's going to be a deep dive. We're going to go through a lot of little journeys and ventures along the way. Some things that I know about, other things I don't know about. Hopefully people will comment and share their experiences. So the color enhancement playlist goals are tinting botanicals for use in arrangements and embellishments to provide more color, longevity, and vibrancy while still maintaining a more natural look, which is probably 75% of the color enhancing that I do. Also, painting flowers for artistic and multimedia use, using the botanical shape and art techniques for a fun and playful look. This where you might want to do something where you put glitter on, or you put metallics on them, or you put funky colors on them. There's any number of things that you can do in that department. Playing with and testing various paints, pigments, and mediums. And to include demonstration, tips, and techniques related to these goals. So that's what the playlist will hopefully encompass as we move forward. The mediums are for tinting to dilute the paints or pigments for use in tinting or painting botanicals. That is the purpose of these. And the supply list would be bottles with a dispenser top, preferably see-through, such as clear or frosted. And today I'm going to use these. These are called frosted, and they have a dispenser top. It's called a disc top, but any dispenser top will work. And if you don't have any of these kind of bottles, you can get, tester bottles from the department stores, or maybe you have some on hand that you can rinse out, that you had maybe lotion or cosmetic bottles that have a dispenser top on there, and you can rinse those out. So you don't have to go out and buy them if you have things on hand. But in my opinion, something clear or see-through, and you will see why I say that in a minute. And the other thing is white vinegar. Any white vinegar will do. I just happen to have a gallon of this on hand because I go through a lot of it, and I also use it in eco-printing. So white vinegar. Also rubbing alcohol. There's all kinds of different kinds. There's 50, 70, 91, 99. So use what you have on hand, or it's not too expensive if you don't have any. Just go to the drugstore and pick some up. I typically use 70% as kind of the midpoint in price and effectiveness. Also distilled water. You can probably use tap water, but I tend to, whenever I'm doing anything like this, I tend to use distilled water, and I just have the local brand from our department store, nothing special. And then a matte medium. Generally an acrylic type of a base, such as Mod Podge. There's all kinds of matte mediums out there. I'm actually going to, after I made my notes, I decided I'm also going to make one with this purple Perfect Paper Adhesive Gloss. Although I prefer matte, I'm just going to make a smaller 2-ounce bottle with both of these formulas, one with a matte and one with the Perfect Paper Adhesive Gloss, just to have on hand to play with as we go forward. And basically we'll also be testing for how they work and any water resistance. Then optional items, of course, are paper towels, and then a permanent marker to mark your bottles, or if you're really wanting to make them look nice and fancy, you can make your own stickers and do something like that, but it's really handy to know what's in the bottle and what your formula ratio was. And then a ruler or a slip of paper, and you'll see why in a minute, and that's for our ratio. I'm just going to use a slip of paper. And then an index card, journal, or notebook if you want to take notes. Let's get started. Mediums discussed in this video are for use with paints. Here's an example of some fabric paint, dyes, pigments, and any other things that might impart color that we can use the medium to dilute them down and make them thin enough to provide a tint. Test with chosen paint first to see how the formulas react. And the formulas are water soluble when wet, and depending upon the base used for the paint medium or the tint, it can be water resistant once dry or not, again depending upon what you use. Once the formula is made, it could be added to the paint. For example, and you've seen me use this container before, this is where it's all mixed together, and all I have to do is take off the top and dip my brush in, because I know I go through a ton of this leaf green. So if you know that you've got a good proven formula that you like and you use a lot of it, that's when you get a bottle, not your formula bottles, but another bottle where you put your pigment or your paint in and then add formula to it. So that's what I mean when I say that it can be added to paint. You can combine it only as needed. For example, if you only are painting one paint, you can put a dab of paint down, and then I would use something non-absorbent. I'm just using this piece of paper as an example. You could put a dab of paint down, dip a little bit of formula in, and then mix it on a case-by-case basis. So that's what I mean when I say mixed, just a little bit on a specific amount. I personally prefer a permanent fabric type dye, paint, or pigment that says pliable and soft. And so this one, it says feels soft. And because it's an acrylic base, I'm sure in here, even though it says it's for fabric, it's pretty much on its own water resistant. And remember that none of this is scientific. You can alter any of these formulas to your own needs. They're just the basic ones that I use, and it's the place to get started at. And so keep that in mind. There's no right or wrong. Some of you may have your own formulas to use. First formula that we're going to do, I'm going to do on camera. I probably won't do every single one of them on camera, because once you see how I do this one, then formula number 2, I'll just show you the slip that I have written down what formula number 2 is, but you'll know from watching this how I'm accomplishing that. Formula 1 is 1 part water, 2 parts rubbing alcohol, I'm going to use 70%, and 1 part white vinegar. And then I made a note with the addition of medium per number 3, 0.12 to 1 part. We're not worrying about the number 3 right now. We will talk further about that in a minute. So we're just doing these 3 items. I use a lot of this particular formula, so I'm going to use a 4-ounce container. I'm going to take my Sharpie pen and my piece of paper, and this is actually pretty simple. I'm just gonna that's how much of the container I'm gonna worry about filling up. And because I do everything in ratios, it's 1 part, 1 part, 1 part, 2 parts, 1 part. So I just need to divide this in 4. So I'm going to fold it in half again, and I'm going to fold it in half again. And so basically, let me put a little line down here so I know it's easier to see. Okay, so all I'm going to do is be real scientific here. And here, And then I'm going to do a smaller one because we've got 2 parts. And then, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 parts. And the other thing I'm going to do before we get started, and I always do the marker first, because if I do the marker later, a lot of times I spill liquid down the side, and then I'm going to wait for it to dry before I use the marker. So I always do this first. And I'm just going to write on here, no fancy labels today. And this is going to be 1 part water, and then 2 parts rubbing alcohol, and then 1, wasn't a very good 2, 1 part vinegar. And if I wasn't on camera, I'd probably try to write a little bit better, but you get the idea. So I'm going to open the container, grab a paper towel just in case I spill. And really, there's no particular order that you have to add it in. I'm just going to start with the 1 part water. And why would I want a formula with more water than others? Maybe I'm using a medium, like a fabric paint, that's thick. And because it's thick, I need to maybe dilute it down a little bit more, and I might want more water because of the thickness. I've used this formula a lot over the years, and it works fine for most things. It's not too wet. Okay, 2 parts rubbing alcohol. Now you can see why I like these bottles, is because I can see where you can see the water in there. You can see what you've added. So I'm going to hold this up at eye level. So I'm off camera here. And I'm going to put in 2 parts of rubbing alcohol. Okay. So you can see there's 2 parts of rubbing alcohol in there. And then the last thing we're going to add is the vinegar. Up to our final line there. Okay, that's it. Then we're going to cap it off. And I'll probably write on here Formula 1 just so I know that I did it on the video and what formulas this was. Especially if you are have a journal or you're taking notes, you can refer to it as Formula 1, for example. Okay, so that's done. The next one that I'm going to do is going to be formula number 2. And formula number 2 is 2 parts rubbing alcohol, and again I'm going to use 70%, 1 part white vinegar. And we're going to ignore the comment about number 3 because we'll talk more in detail about that in a minute. So same thing. I'm going to get a bottle and do that. So I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, formula number 2 was done. I had to adjust my little measuring stick a little bit because there was only 3 parts to worry about in our ratio instead of 4. So I just kind of eyeballed it. 1, 2, 3 on our thing here. So it's 2 parts of rubbing alcohol, 70%, 1 part of vinegar. Now, when I was pouring the rubbing alcohol in, I did spill a little bit, and it ran down the side. Rubbing alcohol, when it's this wet, will affect the Sharpie, so I used my paper towel here, and I just kind of cleaned it up. So that's why it's a good idea, if you want it to be permanent on the bottle, is to put some sort of, I could wrap packing tape around it if I didn't, want to have it rub off, which is another idea if you just want to write on here and not get fancy about it, is just use some packing tape or something on there. So that I'll maybe think about that, doing it later. But there's formula number 2's ready. Formula number 3 I want to talk about for a minute, and once I do, hopefully you'll understand why. The example or the containers that we're going to do is going to be 2 parts of rubbing alcohol. Again, I'm going to use 70%, 1 part vinegar, and then 1 part of acrylic medium. And I'm using 2 smaller 2-ounce bottles because I want to do one with gloss perfect paper adhesive and then one with matte Mod Podge, just to have to play with going forward in the playlist. And so what I said here is the addition of acrylic medium, and I'm just ballparking this here as 0.12 to 1 part as an estimate. It can be more or it could be less, it just depends, and it's something that we're going to be experimenting around. Most of the time that I've used an acrylic medium, I have done it on a case-by-case basis, meaning I've mixed it in with my paint and my medium in a smaller amount right on some sort of palette, for example, I use. These things work good, packing that you get from places. These make good little makeshift palettes. And then, of course, these I use, or any kind of painter's palette, or parchment paper, wax paper, anything that's non-absorbent that you can. This will be the first time that I'm actually making a container with having some of this already in it, and it may, in certain cases, not be strong enough, in which case I would add more on a case-by-case basis. But in continuing to read my notes here, it's easier to add more than it is to take it away or dilute it, which is why we're going to start with just 1 part. For example, matte Mod Podge, matte PPA, etc., or any other binder along these lines. You could try gloss for a shinier finish. However, this addition is only to provide sticking and or mild water repellent properties. Now let me explain what I mean by that. For example, let's compare and contrast. Something like this already has some sort of acrylic-y copolymers in there already, just because of the nature of this type of paint. It just already does. Whereas this liquid grit dye doesn't. If there is anything like that in there, I don't know what their formula is, but if there is anything like that in there, it's very, very minimal. This, because you're not heat setting it, which is what they call for when you're doing fabrics a lot of the time, it could tend to not be as water resistant as you might like it to be. And so, and this is just my theory is that when using dry pigments or other pigments or something that doesn't already have an acrylic binder already as part of it, that by adding our formula with a little of its own acrylic binder might help these to be a little bit more water repellent to a certain extent. And so that's why we're going to do this formula, and I'm going to do it in a bottle so I have it handy. The uses, which I alluded to a minute ago, for example, more waxy botanicals like ivy leaves, where the formulas may bead up if you don't have something that helps to better allow the paint to stick to the botanical. And there's a number of flowers and paints out there that are resinous or waxy or something that if you were to spray a little water on them, you'd see they'd bead up. And so you need that sticking ability. So that's why we're doing that formula. And again, I'm just doing these as, and each one's going to be the same, 2 part rubbing alcohol, 1 part vinegar, and 1 part acrylic medium. So that's 4 parts. And so I don't know if this is going to... It's interesting that the 2-ounce bottle will use the same ratio slip of paper that my 4-ounce bottle did. So I guess the difference between the height from here to here is the fact that the 4 ounces has a bigger diameter. So I don't have to redo my slip of paper. I can just go ahead and make my marks and do my formulas. And again, I will do this off camera. Okay, I put my mediums, my PPA and my matte Mod Podge in last. And so here's what it looks like right now. It just sank to the bottom because it's heavier than the other ingredients. So now I'm going to shake them. And the matte Mod Podge is blending, and the PPA, interestingly enough, is not. So, everything I just said about the PPA gloss, ignore. It is not happy at all. I always believe in leaving bloopers on camera. I knew that the Mod Podge would work, but I didn't know about the PPA. Which, maybe it would have worked if I didn't use vinegar. Which brings me to a comment that Charlotte made. A poster named Charlotte on my video, Viewer Q, How Much Medium to Paint, she indicated that she tried it, I think she said, with a tulip paint that also had glitter in it. And that when she used the vinegar formula, it curdled or clumped. And I think that this is probably what she meant. That's why you should always test a small amount first. I probably should have used a 1 ounce bottle just to make sure, since I hadn't used this formula before, but I was hopeful. So I'm going to get a 1 ounce bottle, and I'm going to make a formula without vinegar and use PPA, and let's see what happens. Okay, I have adjusted the formula for the PPA gloss to be 2 parts rubbing alcohol, 70%, and 1 part of the PPA gloss. And as you can see, without the vinegar, it mixed just fine. So, test and experiment. I have been using vinegar for years, and I really never came across a problem before. However, because of what Charlotte said, and now because of this experiment here, which was the difference between this and this, basically it clumped into something, I don't know what to call that. I don't know if you can pick it up on the camera. And this, which is all mixed up and smooth. So these are the kinds of things that we'll figure out as we go forward with the playlist. Is what works, what doesn't. Now we know that. And then number 4 would be medium used alone, meaning try using rubbing alcohol alone with a fabric paint or some other pigment that already has some acrylic base in the formula, or not, depending upon what you want to experiment with. In this case, 70% or maybe even a 50% rubbing alcohol to water if you're not using anything else with it. Might be a good middle ground. So in conclusion, there's no right or wrong here. Experiment with ratios and what's on hand. The key elements are permanent and flexible, or soft to the touch if possible. Don't throw away faded botanicals you may have on hand, because as long as they're not brown or otherwise rotted or deteriorated, they can be used for tinting and artistic purposes or for testing. And above all, have fun. Please check the color enhancement playlist from time to time to see if any new videos have been posted, or subscribe and ring the bell. Thanks for watching.